The DA and the EFF about coalition discussions in councils, and yes, it seems that really no one wants to do business with anyone. The EFF confirming it's no longer talking to the ANC. The economic freedom fighters say they will talk to Herman Mashaba's Action SA, but he's walked away from them, and for the moment, the ANC seems to be silent. In other words, with just a few days to go until the deadline for councils to elect mayors and speakers, we're still no closer to knowing who's going to govern in the big metros in Gauteng and in Nelson Mandela Bay. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, good afternoon to you, and thanks for your time. So, the parties are telling us who they don't want to work with. Is it slightly surprising that they're not yet telling us who they do want to work with? There's no clarity on these agreements.
Well, there's no clarity, Stephen, particularly because there are no agreements per se. I think they are still open-minded. They're still looking around for suitable partners and also looking for the best deal. You will going to get a lot of talk. You will going to get a lot of grandstanding, including brinkmanship, for instance, taking hard positions in order to pressurize others to agree to your own. So I don't think what people are saying now is necessarily their final stance on things. There might still be something happening. Some are more desperate than others because they have to go back to government. They need to take the responsibility for government to regain lost ground. So there are still concessions to be made, I think.
I mean, part of the problem, I suppose, is the maths. If you look at the ANC and the EFF, the maths would probably let those two work together. I'm not going to say comfortably, but mathematically comfortably. Do you think they'll find each other? I mean, is that still a possibility?
It is a possibility. I mean, they are forced to look at each other, at least, by the numbers. However, whether or not they're able to work together depends on two things. The past experience hasn't been quite reassuring for the ANC, especially to work with the EFF. Yes, previously the EFF did not have any binding agreements with anybody. They voted on issues, and so they could change their mind here and there. But I think their partners expected them to be a little bit reliable and predictable, and it wasn't like that. So that unpredictability of the past is a little bit worrisome for any potential partner, such as the ANC, because the ANC is obviously the majority party, will be the majority party in these coalition arrangements, and so it will take most of the blame should anything happen. So they are worried that the EFF might not be reliable. So it is up to the EFF to issue that reassurance. And perhaps part of that reassurance is to say, well, we'll sign a coalition agreement. The issues are not really so complex. I think the issues can be negotiated, compromises can be made. The nub of the problem is how that agreement is carried out, whether it is sustainable, and what you do in instances of conflict. For me, that's the key issue that will settle whether or not they get into a coalition.
Is there a risk that what actually happens is that people lie about the coalition discussion? So, for example, the EFF said today the ANC was only interested in positions and not principles. And Professor, you know how things happen in our politics. I happen to have seen a document written by the ANC to the EFF spelling out their negotiation principles. So in other words, I presume if you look at that document, it may be that the EFF is lying. There's now a lot of scope for people to accuse other people of lying during coalition negotiations, which could actually seed more distrust rather than create more trust.
Well, the one thing I like really about today's press conferences is that these two parties, EFF and the TA, have come out to report what the issues are. It's obviously not up to these two parties to talk on behalf of the ANC. The ANC must come and talk on its own behalf and tell us what these issues are. I'm not surprised that Malema, for instance, might have misrepresented the ANC position because he wants to take, gain some credibility here and say we are looking at forming coalitions, but we are simply being frustrated by the ANC. So it's typical of parties in negotiations to play these kinds of games. But what I like, I must say though, the ANC of course still has to come and we'll discuss ANC positions. But what I like about the EFF position is that of course, they are raising issues that are core to their own identity, to their own constituency. At face value, you might think that these things are difficult to do, but they are putting things on the table that we have been thinking about. For instance, student historical debt, the availability of health facilities. So some of these things are things that, even though perhaps the ANC might not commit to supporting them immediately, but can commit to some time frame. So I quite like the fact that they're putting something on the table, and these are things that are critical to our own future as a society. So I'm keen then to hear the ANC. If the ANC says they disagree with the EFF, I'm keen to hear what exactly are they disagreeing on. Are they disagreeing purely on principle that these demands are stupid, or are they saying, yes, in principle we do agree, but let's see how we can implement them, if not now, but over time?
I mean, it's very interesting because we've been through a period before where we had coalitions without agreements, and Nelson Mandela Bay is the classic case. We saw what happened there from 2016 really onwards for quite a long period after that election. I mean, the risk is that unless we have coalition agreements, unless things change, we could have that happening in other places. We could have that happening in Nelson Mandela Bay again. We could have it happening in all three of the big metros in Gauteng. In fact, that's probably one of the more likely outcomes.
Well, there are two possible scenarios here. If they can't form coalition agreements, they can decide to go the same route as the EFF previously, that you vote purely on issues. So you will have a minority government supported on the basis of issue by issue as and when it comes up. The first issue obviously would be for the first council meeting to correct, and you vote for a speaker, this and that. So in that process of bargaining, hopefully there would be some bargaining. If people show up for a meeting, it means that they are open to some bargaining process. So they would have to vote on who takes this, who takes that, without necessarily a formal agreement. And have that arrangement go on throughout the duration of this tenure. However, it's a bit risky because, you don't know how people are. They are not bound to anything. So that's a bit of a risk. But if you do have a coalition agreement in place, even that is not sufficient to guarantee the sustainability of that coalition. One, everybody must commit to it. It must be binding. There must be some legal force behind it. And secondly, make sure that when there are disputes, whoever you appoint to arbitrate over that dispute is purely independent. They had this thing in PE, the DA, UTM, FF plus. Disputes did arise, but the way they went about resolving those disputes was not entirely credible. They decided among themselves to look into those disputes, and the outcome was somewhat partisan, right? So one, you need to make sure that parties are punished for not abiding by the agreement. Secondly, disputes are handled by completely independent parties. In that way, we are guaranteed, or we have much larger prospects of coalitions, being stable. It's not a complete guarantee, but it maximizes prospects of stability.
And in the middle of this, we have the deadline. I mean, next week now, really. I understand the National Structures Act talks about 14 working days, so I think that's Monday, Tuesday next week. And after that, the provinces are supposed to intervene if there's no speaker or mayor elected. And even that can be political because the provinces, the administration in the province, ANC in most cases, may not really want to see some of these other administrations being elected. It gets intensely complicated from there.
Well, if they can't set up, say, because all you need, Stephen, actually in municipalities and council, on the inaugural meeting, you need to elect officials. That's fine. And then you'll have meetings every second week or whenever there's a special council meeting called. And on that council meeting, you'd need voting to happen, 50 plus 1%. So you can have a minority government. The fact that you will not have coalition agreements ahead of the deadline is not really a crisis in and of itself. What becomes a crisis is when you can't vote on the day of voting. Then that means that you might have to call in administrators. You might have to look at the possibility of a rerun. But I do think that none of these parties are keen to go for a rerun. They don't have money. And no one has an appetite for another election. And I'm sure the IEC will also tell them that there's no money to do this thing. So you must get together and iron out some deals. Yeah, and the idea of having an administrator coming in to run things is also not a possibility that they are keen to have.
Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, always appreciate the time. Thanks very much indeed on Newsfeed. Won't be the last time we bother you for a conversation around coalitions before this time next week, I'm sure.